The views expressed by our guests are their own and do not reflect the official stance of their employer or any affiliated organizations. Welcome back to the Counsel House Podcast. I'm your co-host, Daniel Abramoff. Today we have another great episode with the Chief Legal Officer at EagleBank, Paul Saltzman. We had Paul on to talk about his experience going from a large institution now to a mid-sized one, the different regulatory challenges that arise, as well as building a really first-class legal team and what goes with it. I hope you enjoy. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited.
Jumping into it, your career has spanned from various organizations of different sizes. You were over at Deutsche Bank, you were at the Clearing House as well, and now EagleBank. How have these experiences shaped your approach to being in-house in the banking sector?
Well, that's a great question, Daniel. I've had a varied career, big firms, small firms, different types of financial institutions. But I think most importantly, I've held business roles. And I think, in direct answer to your question, I think the fact that I've held business roles creates a sort of intellectual empathy as an in-house lawyer, because I'd been on the other side. I've been the client. Both as chief operating officer or, in the case of the clearinghouse, the president of the organization. And when you are in a client role where you have a general counsel or outside lawyers serving you in your non-legal capacity, it just creates a lot of empathy and experience in better dealing with your clients when you're in that legal role.
And so, having worked in these different sized environments, what would you say the key differences are in terms of the legal challenges you're observing?
Again, great question. So first of all, I would say that size is not necessarily a determinant of culture and environment. I think in the banking space, working at a regional bank, a large community bank, and then obviously with the clearinghouse being exposed to large banks, and then at Deutsche Bank, there are certain structural and organizational difference that I'll discuss in a minute. But every organization is different. I would say the biggest distinction is the localized decision making in a way. At a larger bank or a larger firm, you're not, even if you're the general counsel, you're not necessarily one removed from the decision maker. There's a committee, there's layers of supervision, there's layers of authority. Whereas in a smaller organization, just say for Eagle, I walk right into the chief lending officer's office. I walk right into the CEO's office unannounced, and the ability to be responsive immediately, to interact directly with the decision makers, I think is a big difference in my experience. I would say also, and I think we may be getting to this later, but smaller organizations tend to be price takers of the regulatory environment. We don't have a government affairs shop. We're not going to necessarily lobby directly on the regulatory environment that we operate in, and we work through trade associations. Whereas larger banks, I think, both have the capacity and feel empowered to help shape the regulatory environment that they're operating in. Whereas for Eagle and other similarly situated banks, it's just, this is what the landscape is. We're going to follow it and move on.
And you have to know where you're going to play.
100%.
Yeah. It's interesting. You look at these larger banks in contrast to the smaller ones. And to your point, you have all these government affairs folks. You have everyone pushing at a big wheel. Whereas when you're at the smaller spot, you're learning about where you all fit in. But internally, it's almost the opposite. Internally, you can cut through a bunch of red tape to get things done faster, it sounds like,
Yes.
to everyone's benefit. Whereas a larger organization like that, you're going to have to go through different levels.
Sure.
And time is valuable.
Absolutely. Time is a competitive advantage. If you can get back to a client on a lending decision, for example, being responsive within a 24, 48-hour period. And I also want to be clear, governance is critical. So, having local decision-making, fast execution, informed judgment doesn't mean that you don't have a well-governed decision-making process. So I want to make that sort of clear, because at least in my experience, certainly one of the roles of the general counsel is to ensure that this balance between bureaucracy and oversight and proper governance. So I think, at a regional bank, that's a key distinction.
That makes sense. And you talk about balances. There seems to be a lot of different balances that need to go on. When it comes to risk-based approaches and dealing with your internal teams, how has that looked in your career?
When I was running CCAR at Deutsche Bank, CCAR stands for the Comprehensive Capital, it's basically stress testing. And part of the stress testing framework is a pyramid approach where it all begins and starts with risk identification and a risk-based approach to determining how much capital a bank should have. So I learned a lot about enterprise risk management through my experience at Deutsche Bank. And one of the things that I learned is that partnering with the chief risk officer is absolutely critical. So I would say the first thing, not just at Eagle, but at other financial institutions, and I might argue at other public companies where there is a chief risk officer, making sure that the general counsel partners with the chief risk officer, because legal risk is an enterprise risk, right? And so I think that's number one. The other thing is, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, but one of the key differences between being in-house and being outside is the in-house lawyer is expected to make decisions and to be decisive. The stereotype is on the one hand, on the other hand, lawyers can't make up their mind. Good in-house lawyers make up their mind. If you are indecisive, you're not going to be successful. And so looking at each legal decision through the prism of risks and costs and benefits, I think is really a fundamental guiding principle and approach that you should have throughout your function, throughout your career.
I think that's exactly right. You look at these organizations which are very successful, and you have a bunch of business men and women that are running with the ball, and I think they share that same thought, right? You will fix what needs to be fixed later, but you got to make up your decision.
Absolutely. And you do the best you can. I think, only in the academic setting do you have perfect information set. So you're often required to make decisions without 100% information. And you just have to be decisive and pull the trigger and be confident that you've made the best choice possible.
And that's where coming in to other executives, being able to have the right messaging, the right information given to them is so key. And so how do you typically tailor that type of communication? How does that look?
It's interesting. I'm teaching a course now at GW called Legal Writing for the C-Suite, and it really cuts, I'm an adjunct there, and it cuts to the heart of that question, because there really is a different type of communication skill set that's required if you're operating in the C-suite. If you're writing a 35-page appellate memo, that's one thing. But if you're writing a memo to the CEO or the head of commercial lending, and you give them a 35-page memo, you might as well not have given it to them, because they're not going to read it. So I think the key is brevity, being concise. That's really the key to C-suite writing. Taking information that could easily be communicated in 20 pages and turning it into a 2-page memo. Again, with action-oriented, decisive guidance. Business people, they want their lawyers to be problem solvers. And so this notion that there's a legal swim lane and a business swim lane, that's not really true, because good decisions embrace both and integrate both into the decision making. So I think that's that's something that I would observe as well.
And so once that takes place, where you're going in there to give this memo, how do you typically ensure that your advice is going to align with the strategic goals of the business?
So I think, look, a good general counsel is part of the C-suite, right? A good general counsel understands and appreciates that their client is the institution, not any individual. So the corporate entity is their client. And so a good general counsel also is both participating and aware of the strategic goals of the organization that they represent. So I'd say the first thing is um, ex ante involvement, right? What you don't want is you don't want to be handed a piece of paper which says, okay, here are the 10 strategic goals. And by the way, you weren't consulted beforehand. And some of these strategic goals raise legal risks or legal issues. So the first thing I would say is be involved in the creation of the strategic goals, and that will ensure that those strategic goals are followed and in line with your legal advice. Because if those strategic goals, I'm going to repeat myself, but if those strategic goals are created outside the purview of the legal risk framework, then it's going to be very difficult to make sure that your actions, your advice, the company's actions are aligned with those strategic goals. So that makes sense.
It does, and continuing that conversation, the communication in the right way with the business sounds like that's exactly what needs to be done to avoid things being left out, and also having a great team for yourself as well.
100%. I want to get back to the point about C-suite writing as well, which is you have to speak in plain English, right? It's not just brevity and concise advice, whether it's oral or written. You have to communicate. It normally takes two to tango when you're communicating. The listener, the speaker. But I really do believe that a highly effective general counsel has the accountability and the burden of communicating in plain English. You can synthesize all the technicalities, but what comes out of your mouth has to be easily understood, by your client. Otherwise, they're not going to buy into the advice and they're not going to follow it.
And it really could potentially create more speed bumps in the road if they really don't even understand what the
100%.
goal is of avoiding certain risks.
100%.
So when building out your team of attorneys in-house, what are some leadership principles that guide you in retaining and developing that talent?
So throughout the course of my career, I literally have mentored and hired dozens, if not almost 100 people. So I kind of have a good sense, I think, and I'm very proud of the fact that many of the people that I've mentored are now kind of very successful in their own right. Um, it's a very personal question. You wouldn't think it maybe, but it really is a very personal question because my approach is my approach. It may not work for someone else. It also depends on the role. Um, if I was hiring, and I have in certain circumstances, hired an intellectual property lawyer, that's a discipline where I probably need an intellectual property lawyer who has experience because it's a very um, technical sort of silo within the legal framework. On the other hand, if I'm hiring a transactional lawyer or a litigator, I might have more flexibility not to necessarily rely on their experience, but to look at their core competencies. And I think that circles back to my philosophy. I've always hired people with strong core competencies and have not necessarily relied upon experience. Because in my world, in my experience, if you have someone who is smart, eager to learn, has the work ethic, and is willing to put in the time and effort to learn, and is also humble in understanding what they don't know. And if there's that baseline core competency, uh, then they can develop into that expert that you need. Um, in my own case, I've always also hired people, Daniel, with strong interpersonal skills, which I think is not something, and I think that's another distinction between being an in-house lawyer and being an outside lawyer. You can be you can be successful as an introvert in an outside. I'm not being judgmental about introverts or extroverts, but I'm just saying you can be very successful being an introvert in a law firm. You cannot be successful as a general counsel if you're introverted simply because of the interpersonal skill sets that are needed. So I've always looked to talent that has strong interpersonal skill sets, uh, good public speaking, good organizational skill sets, a nice person, good work ethic. And then lastly, I would say, that's the recruiting decision. There's also the retention component, and the retention component is very simple, which is um, make the person feel valued, I usually tend to hire, um, I don't know if I can say younger, I guess maybe I'll say younger, but maybe younger professionals and have stretch goals and give them huge opportunities way beyond their years of experience. That's worked very well for me because they feel empowered and they feel like they have a future. And I think if you value employees and you give them a vision of what their professional life will look like in the future, that's a prescription for success.
And they'll truly feel cared for. And it's interesting you talk about being a GC and how unlikely it is that somebody who is truly introverted would become a general counsel. And it makes perfect sense to me because as a general counsel, you really have to stick your neck out all the time. And you have to dip into places that you either never have been to or in a very small amount of time have spent time there.
Sure.
So that makes perfect sense to me. And while there are some folks that have a good blend of introvert and extroversion, I can completely appreciate that.
By the way, that's not to say if you're introverted, you can't be successful, especially if you supplement your team with people who are a little bit more extroverted, like a deputy general counsel or associate general counsel that are a little bit, it's about the team, but, your question was about my preferences in terms of hiring. And I've historically had a preference to hire people that have been very strong leaders and that have very strong interpersonal skill sets.
What are some proactive measures that you'll put in place to anticipate regulatory changes? And how do you ensure compliance without getting in the way of business innovation?
That question is more prolific than you might think because it really cuts at the heart of what a good in-house counsel is because, you could be Dr. No. It's very easy to be completely risk averse in your legal advice. And when business professionals come to you, oh, you can't do that. I need legal opinions or that's a problem or whatever. So I think the first thing you need to do is really embrace a can-do attitude. And I think if the business people, this is really important, Daniel. I think if the business people trust you and if the business people think that you're a can-do general counsel and that you're really trying to make things work, then they will respect the no decision, more
Right.
because they know that you will have tried.
True.
But balancing legal constraints and risks, it goes back to what I had said earlier, which is, you know, think of an issues bell curve. You've got really easy issues, really complicated issues, and a bunch of issues in the middle. For really easy issues, it's kind of a no-brainer. You know the answer, it's black and white, whatever. For really complicated issues, you're probably going to involve outside counsel. You're probably going to have a dialogue with the client. So the bulk of the issues are in the middle, and the middle is very gray, right? So that's where I think you have to assess the materiality of the issue. You have to level expectations with your client. You have to be involved early in the decision making so that you are shaping the direction of the transaction or the new product. What you don't want is a situation where you're presented with a fait accompli and you're forced to say this doesn't work. So being involved early, I think, is critical to having that consensus legal business sort of risk profile.
And having the business team feel almost excited to be able to bring something to you as opposed to thinking, oh gosh, we're just going to get this cut down. That is a polar opposite right there.
I've heard before, of course it's not me, but I've heard before it's like, oh, we're not going to legal. We're not going to ask legal this question because we know the answer. So we're better off, asking for forgiveness than permission. That's not a good culture.
No.
That's not a healthy culture. If you're afraid to go to your attorneys because you think they're not going to be cooperative or helpful, that's a problem.
And then
That's a fundamental problem.
and then they make even potentially larger mistakes
Correct.
in digging into the risk area as
Correct.
well. So when a legal crisis occurs, I would love to hear about throughout your career how you sort of rose above and jumped ahead of it.
So it's kind of interesting because I think one of the areas of my career that I'm most proud of is I really have been at the forefront of a lot of crises. I mean, crisis is a relative term, but, when I was at Kidder Peabody, there were issues in the early 90s. Kidder ultimately got taken over by Payne Weber. So my career is kind of marked by institutional crises where they needed my kind of leadership. And I would say, the first sort of lesson is try not and be emotional. Try and extract the emotion. And for example, when I was chief operating officer of eSpeed, which is the electronic trading arm of Cantor Fitzgerald right after September 11th, very, very emotional, situation, came in to try and help Howard Lutnick rebuild the company after September 11th. So I wouldn't say that was a momentary crisis, but you had to extract the emotion of the situation to deal with the challenges. Same thing in a post-Dodd-Frank environment when I was running the clearinghouse, same thing with Deutsche Bank. So first way to approach it is to try and be rational and dispassionate. The second thing is take bite sizes. You're not going to be able to solve any crisis of meaningful proportion is not going to be able to be solved overnight, or it's not going to be able to be solved by one sort of magic bullet. So, having the vision, Daniel, to look at a crisis and to break it down into component parts and then slowly but surely tackle the component parts is the way you deal with a crisis, because essentially what you want to do is you want to create optionality. You want to take decisions, you want to make decisions, you want to take actions that preserve your options, and you want to deal with each sort of situation as it presents itself. And doing that generally, will bring calm to the organization, will bring trust to the organization so that you can sort of get back on track. I would say maybe by force of personality or habit, but my candor and my frank talk is also has been personally helpful to me, but I think is also critical in a crisis because if the institution is euphemistic and is not really seeing the crisis unfold before it, it's not going to be able to react. You have to recognize the root cause of an issue, recognize the seriousness of the crisis. And if everyone's around the room engaged in groupthink, or what I sometimes call the kumbaya environment, because no one really likes to ask the tough question or the awkward question. If you're surrounded by sycophantic, or euphemistic approaches or characterizations, you're just not going to be able to deal with the crisis. So a general counsel is a quarterback that comes in, that takes control of the situation, brings calm to the environment, and helps compartmentalize the issues so they can be slowly and surely. Um, a crisis becomes a mini crisis. A mini crisis then becomes, a manageable crisis, and then a manageable crisis is resolved and becomes kind of run the bank or run the business the way it should be.
And talking about the fact that the general counsel is like a quarterback, I think that's exactly right. Breaking each piece of that crisis down and looking at the overview of the blueprint is really only something one person can do.
I would say it's only something one person could do efficiently and effectively. There can only be one quarterback on the field. But I think the hallmark of a good general counsel in a crisis environment is you are like a quarterback in that uh, you need your team. You need your offense to carry the sports analogy. You need your offensive lineman. You need your running back. You need your wide receivers. So when you're managing a crisis, first thing is you're understanding who the client is. Technically the client is the institution, but who are you taking direction from? Um, whether it be outside or inside. Lawyers who don't have clients get in trouble. That is such a almost cliche. So who is your client? Who are you listening to? Is your CFO your client? Is this a financial crisis? Is the CEO your client? Is this a regulatory or governmental matter, in which case the board might be your client? So who's your client and who's helping you define how you approach a particular issue? That's also a critical part of managing a crisis.
And that dives a little bit back into what we were talking about when it comes to being able to form those good relationships with the other C-suite and know exactly what is going to make them tick or laugh.
You have to be perceived as a partner. Period. End of story.
Yep.
If you are perceived as the lawyer, if you are perceived as simply the outside lawyer who happens to be sitting in the conference room, then it's not going to work. You have to be perceived and trusted as a member of and I'm talking in a general counsel slot. Obviously, if you're a more junior lawyer, embracing that same methodology, I think, is wise, but it's obviously less likely to be impactful. But throughout my career, I've always been recruited and have looked at opportunities. But one of the first questions I've always asked is this a lawyer-friendly organization? Do they look at lawyers as firefighters or smoke detector preventers? Do they view lawyers as somebody who is involved in the process ex ante, shaping the operating environment? Or are they, oh my God, the house is on fire, let me call the lawyer? And obviously the former is a much more mature approach to legal risk management than the latter.
When it comes to picking the right outside counsel for the right job, what criteria do you use to select and manage that firm?
That's a really, really great question. And, I have, again, experience. I was running the financial institutions practice at White & Case, so I have an interesting perspective. Early in my career, I was an outside lawyer, but that didn't really count. So I was just being worked to death in big law. But I would say, and this is maybe where a regional bank is a little different than a big bank, going back to some of your earlier question, cost is a factor. It just is. I mean, I could give you the politically correct answer and say, oh, I'm going to pick the expert and the best lawyer. But, the reality of it is that for most things, there are a number of very good lawyers that you can retain. Obviously, if it's a very, very unique, so for example, just drawing on Eagle's expertise, sometimes in a lending transaction, we may need some environmental legal advice because there's some toxic something or other in the property. Or recently we've experienced, we're dealing with some nursing homes who are borrowers. So we needed some special expertise in terms of these types of elder care facilities. In those circumstances, expertise is going to be the driver, But generally speaking, all things being equal, I think cost is probably a factor more so than in larger firms. The materiality threshold is different. $2 million to EagleBank is a big deal. $2 million to JP Morgan is not even a rounding error.
Right.
But you also don't want to let cost be the primary driver because that's penny wise, pound foolish. You take an example like Disclosure Counsel, who's advising you on your 34 Act reports. You're not going to pick a firm because you're going to save $100,000 when a class action lawsuit could cost you tens of millions.
Yeah.
So I would say expertise, cost, and then another factor, which is probably an intangible, likability.
Yeah.
It's just really simple, which is when you're sitting down with somebody, if you're going to work with them over a period of time, it's just an intangible sense. Do you want to work with this person?
Right.
You
Is this person good under stress in the trenches that you all are working together in?
Are they helping you solve problems?
Right.
Are they creating problems? Are they calibrating, issues properly? Is every molehill a mountain? Is every legal issue a crisis? Are they looking at things with an eye towards resolving issues, dampening emotions? That's what you sort of look for. And all that is packaged in kind of an intangible sense of likability.
I have a final question for you that I like to ask all our guests.
Oh, geez. Wow. Awkward.
Yeah, this is the one I've been waiting for. No.
Oh, okay.
for all the younger attorneys that are just getting into the
Sure.
profession, what would be a piece or two of advice that you'd like to give them?
Integrity. Let's just start with that, because you never get a second chance to make a first impression, and you can have years and years of positive goodwill and years of positive accomplishments that can be destroyed in a nanosecond by not embracing um, a more objective concept of integrity. And what do I mean by integrity? Candor, transparency, obviously truth, speaking truth to power. So I would say to the young attorneys, um, it sounds again so corny, I'm hesitant to say it, but kind of do the right thing. Um, you will be pressured, and you will have to say no sometimes. You don't want to be Dr. No, but you will have to say no sometimes. You will have to kill a deal. And you will be called a deal killer. You will have to tell a trader, that they can't do that trade and hear them babble about how the lawyer prevented me from making money. And you need to have the confidence, that doing those things on behalf of the institution and doing those things in a manner that protects the institution is really what your job is. So I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is be interpersonally strong. And for younger attorneys who have lived through COVID and who live in a world now where they may have only known Zoom, I would say don't forget the human interaction with your clients. I have the head of our C&I lending, a woman we just hired, Evelyn Lee, who's amazing. She sits a floor below me. Um, every chance I get, I walk down and I go into our office, even if it's for a 2-minute something or other, as opposed to texting or emailing. So don't forget that human touch. So those are two easy kind of things that I would just suggest the younger attorneys pay attention to.
I think those are excellent pieces of advice. And I love asking this question because I always get somewhat of a similar answer, but a completely different answer, right?
Sure.
And different examples. But speaking on integrity, something when you're younger, you really do move a lot quicker. You don't really think about the implications that occur.
The long-term
The long-term ones, right? And in the legal industry, it's all long-term. Everyone knows each other.
Sure.
And then when it comes to the second piece of advice as well, I think that, ultimately it's being in person is something that a lot of people are forgetting the value of. But when you're with each other, you cut through so much compared to if it's digitally. And so going back to the future of your industry, of being an attorney, that piece as well blends perfectly in there. You make your connections now and help each other in the future. Well, this was an excellent interview. I really appreciate you sitting
quick.
down.
Wow, that went quick. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really am excited to share this for the podcast and
Sure.
have all our listeners.
All right. I
listen in.
hope my insights could be helpful.
Thank you so much.
Good deal.